Hi everyone, my name is Sebastian,
My name is Luca.
And I'm Ricky.
and we'll be presenting our Capstone project, FlowJo Report Export to PowerPoint. This right here is our presentation. It's made up of about 6,500 lines of JSON code, and we're going to use what we've been working on the last couple of terms to make our presentation. At a high level, our project takes a FlowJo report JSON file and turns it into a PowerPoint presentation that is editable, readable, and ready for stakeholder review. This matters because FlowJo reports are not just simple documents. They contain scientific layouts. When those reports are exported incorrectly, the meaning of the report can be lost. So our goal was not just to make a PowerPoint, our goal was to preserve the structure and layout of the report well enough that someone could open the PowerPoint, trust what they were seeing, and still edit it if needed.
Before discussing the solution, it's important to understand the users we're building for. FlowJo is a software platform used by scientists to analyze flow cytometry data. In simple terms, flow cytometry is a technique that measures the characteristics of thousands of individual cells, helping researchers identify populations, detect biological signals, and evaluate experimental results. Researchers use FlowJo to interpret that data and create reports that communicate their findings. Those reports are often shared with stakeholders who don't work directly in FlowJo. Instead, they rely on PowerPoint presentations for reviews, discussions, and decision-making. Because of that, the report isn't just a collection of data. The layout itself helps explain the scientific story. Our goal was to preserve both the information and the meaning behind that layout when exporting to PowerPoint. With those users in mind, we defined a set of project goals that guided the development of the exporter.
Now we're going to go over the main problem we were trying to solve. FlowJo reports are not just random charts and text boxes. They are spatial documents, meaning the layout itself helps explain the science. A plot, its gates, labels, tables, and annotations all work together to tell a story. So if the PowerPoint export is broken, it's not just a visual issue. If labels get clipped, gates shift out of place, or grouped objects separate, the meaning of the report can be lost or misunderstood. Our goal was to create a reliable export where the content stays readable, the layout stays faithful to the original report, and the final PowerPoint is still editable for stakeholders. The big idea is that layout fidelity protects the trust in the science. Now we're going to go to the first part of our demo to demonstrate what bad output looks like. And it is going to pull up a old version of our report.json, and we're going to see that things like text gets wrapped and looks weird. You have rotation that just gets cluttered and funky. You have things like tables that are supposed to be there and don't show up. Graphs and their axis labels all get cluttered and funky. And then you also don't have grouping. So when moving stuff around, like all this stuff should move together. And now you have a real pain in trying to move stuff around with this graph.
What success looked like for us. First, we needed broad element support, and that meant rendering major pieces of FlowJo report, things like text, tables, charts, graphs, and images. Next, we needed layout fidelity. The exported PowerPoint had to preserve the original report's position, size, rotation, anchors, and z-order. In other words, we needed objects to land where they were supposed to land. Third, the output had to be stakeholder ready. The final deck needed to be readable, accurate, and polished enough for presentations or sponsor review. The biggest technical goal was native grouping. Related report objects like a graph and its labels should stay together as a real PowerPoint group instead of becoming a bunch of disconnected shapes. Finally, we wanted this to work through both a local CLI workflow and a REST API, while also being testable so that future changes would not break layout behavior.
Now we're going to go over the overall pipeline for how the report becomes an editable PowerPoint. We start with the FlowJo report JSON, which contains the pages and all the elements on those pages. From there, the layout engine handles things like anchors, transformations, sizing, and positioning so the objects land in the correct place. Next, the renderer turns the different report elements into PowerPoint objects like text, tables, charts, and visuals. The shape registry tracks the PowerPoint IDs that get created, which become important later for grouping. Then the grouping adapter handles native PowerPoint groups through OOXML, and the final result is an editable PPTX file. The important part is both the CLI export and REST API export use the same tested export path, so we are not maintaining two separate systems.
At the end of the project, we delivered a complete export pipeline that turns FlowJo report JSON into editable PowerPoint presentations. Rather than just generating static slide images, our exporter preserves the structure of the original report so stakeholders can still review, move, and edit objects inside PowerPoint. We also preserve grouping behavior, allowing related report objects to stay together as native PowerPoint groups after export. To support the full workflow, we added an image service, command line generation, REST-based export jobs, and regression checks to protect layout quality. Together, these pieces transform the exporter from a proof of concept into a reliable engineering solution. While the final product may look straightforward, several technical challenges had to be solved to make this level of fidelity possible.
Now we're going to cover why faithful export was more complicated than just drawing shapes onto a slide. FlowJo reports are hierarchical, which means elements can be inside parent groups, and those children inherit things like position, rotation, and layout context. One major challenge was anchor math. FlowJo uses normalized anchor points while PowerPoint expects objects to be positions more like a top left coordinate system. Rotation also added complexity, especially for rotated groups and axis labels, because we had to combine transformations correctly. On top of that, Z-ordered mattered. Graphs, gates, labels, and annotations needed to stay in the correct front to back order. And finally, the output could not just be a screenshot. Stakeholders needed real, selectable PowerPoint objects. All of these challenges came together around grouping, not just where objects appear, but how they behave after export.
This was our main technical challenge, turning FlowJo groups into real PowerPoint groups. Grouping mattered because the export could not just look correct as a static image, it had to remain editable. For example, if a user clicks on a graph in a PowerPoint, they should be able to move the graph, its gates, its labels, and annotations together. The hard part is that FlowJo and PowerPoint represent grouping very differently. In FlowJo, groups are stored as JSON hierarchies using parent IDs and children IDs. Child elements inherit layout behavior from their parent. But PPTX Gen.js mainly helps us draw shapes. It does not automatically convert that FlowJo hierarchy into native PowerPoint group objects. So our main solution was a multi-step process. First, we rendered all visible shapes. Then we captured the generated PowerPoint object IDs and mapped them back to their FlowJo elements. After that, we rebuilt the group tree using the report JSON, and finally we post-processed the PowerPoint OOXML package to create real native groups. To do that, we had to work with OOXML, which stands for Office Open XML. In simple terms, a PPTX file is not just one file, it is actually a zip package made up of XML files, relationships, slide definitions, and drawing objects. PowerPoint reads those XML files to understand what shapes exist, where they are placed, and how they are grouped. The challenge was that PPTX Gen.js could not just generate the visible shapes, but it had to give us a direct way to create exact native group structure that we needed. So even if the slide looked correct visually, the objects were still separate in PowerPoint. The result is that related report objects can move together in PowerPoint while still remaining editable. Once the exporter worked, the next challenge was proving that it worked consistently. We used several layers of validation. Unit tests covered layout helpers and edge cases, especially around coordinate conversion and positioning behavior. We also used a reference deck with known difficult layouts. That gave us examples with things like rotated labels, nested objects, charts, images, tables, and grouped elements. Then we converted generated PowerPoint slides into images so that we can compare the visual output. This let us catch regressions that might not show up in normal code tests. The kinds of things that we cared about were things that stakeholders would notice. Things like clip text, incorrect anchors, rotated label drift, broken image URLs, z-index mistakes, table or chart layout problems, and grouped objects that were no longer moving together. So validation was not just about checking that a file was created, it was about checking that the exported presentation preserved the layout and trustworthiness of the original FlowJo report.
The exporter itself was only part of the solution. We also wanted a workflow that could integrate into larger systems. To support that, we built an asynchronous REST API around the exporter. The client submits a report generation request, receives a job ID, checks the job status, and then downloads the finished PowerPoint once processing is complete. Using asynchronous jobs prevents long-running exports from blocking requests and makes the system more scalable for larger reports. Most importantly, the API uses the exact same export engine as the command line workflow, so every export benefits from the same rendering logic and validation process. We can now show the exporter end-to-end from report JSON input to the finished editable PowerPoint.
Now we're going to focus on the second part of the live demo. The idea is pretty simple from the user's point of view. We submit a report.json, run the export job, download the generated PowerPoint, and then review the result. Now it's going to pull up a later version of our project when it was complete. So now we have all the text that looks proper, isn't getting clipped or wrapped. We have rotated text that is correct and looks clean, and the output that we're looking for. We have all these images that are stacked correctly, Z orders maintained. Now we have proper tables that show up, and that can be moved all as one because they're grouped properly. And then we will go to the graphs, and now you can see these graphs and their axis labels are all correct now in correct positions, and they're all one thing. So we can move this graph all as one now instead of like beforehand where we had to move them separately and it was kind of a pain. But you do also have the ability to move them separately if you want to. We also have a version of a report that our sponsor gave us. This is what a FlowJo report would look like. You have different graphs from their flow cytometers that are positioned properly and are all grouped together so you can move them properly and edit if you need to.
This project demonstrates that complex FlowJo reports can be transformed into editable PowerPoint presentations while preserving their structure and meaning. We successfully supported the major report elements, maintained layout fidelity through anchor and rotation calculations, and preserved grouping behavior through native PowerPoint groups. Beyond the exporter itself, we also built validation tools, regression testing workflows, and both CLI and REST-based export options. The biggest takeaway is trust. Scientists and stakeholders can work from the exported PowerPoint knowing that the information, layout, and relationships from the original report have been preserved. Thank you.